Nioh is one of the most underrated action RPG series ever made. After finishing Nioh 3, I'm even more convinced of that. When people talk about elite combat systems, the conversation almost always goes straight to Souls games like Elden Ring. And those games absolutely deserve that praise. But Nioh has quietly been doing something different, something deeper, and in many ways more demanding. This is a game that rewards mastery. The more you learn, the more the combat opens up, and by the end, it feels like you're not just surviving fights, you're shaping them. Or getting absolutely humbled by a boss for a 10th time in a row, which also happens. Nioh 3 isn't trying to be cinematic or story first, it's about systems, choice, and constantly refining how you play. Welcome to Logging. Today I'm reviewing Nioh 3. If you're new to the channel, every game is broken down using my 10 category review rubric, looking at everything from story and gameplay to innovation, performance, player choice, and overall fun factor. So in this review, I'm going to explain why Nioh 3 delivers one of the best gameplay experiences in the genre, where it struggles, and why this series deserves way more recognition than it gets. Let's start with the strongest part of the game, gameplay. For me, this is a straight 10 out of 10. Combat feels fast, precise, and extremely responsive and fun. And more importantly, it rewards mastery. The more you understand the systems, the more control you feel over every fight. Weapon variety is fantastic, and every weapon genuinely changes the rhythm of combat. You have classic choices like the sword and dual swords, for balance, technical play, heavier options like the Odachi or Spear that focus on spacing and timing, and more specialized weapons like the Kusarigama, Switchblade, and Tonfa that completely shift how encounters feel. The Kusarigama in particular is incredibly fun to use, combining speed, range, and creativity, letting you pressure enemies from distances that feel almost unfair. Tonfa is aggressive and key-focused, great for breaking enemy stamina, while Switchblade feels fluid and stylish, constantly rewarding movement and adaptability. Combat speed is high, but it never feels chaotic once you understand the core mechanics. Key pulse timing becomes essential. Managing your stamina correctly and pulsing at the right moment keeps the momentum going, while mistakes leave you exposed immediately. It creates a rhythm where offense and recovery blend together instead of feeling separate. And this is where Nioh really separates itself from many other action RPGs. You're not just dodging and attacking, you're managing tempo, position, stamina, and pressure at the same time. But the biggest innovation, and probably my favorite system in the entire game, is the ability to switch between ninja and samurai styles. This is brilliant design. You essentially get two builds in one. A lighter, faster ninja style, focused on mobility and evasion, a heavier, tankier samurai style, built around guarding and direct confrontation. Unlike many Souls games where you usually commit to one build and invest most of your upgrade points into either a heavy tank setup or a light stamina focused build, Nioh 3 lets you have both at the same time. You're not locked into one identity, which makes experimentation far more neutral. You can switch instantly with a button press, and the game actively encourages you to do so because it changes how you approach different enemies. And the connection to combat design is really smart. Samurai style works extremely well when fighting human enemies, where guarding, timing, and disciplined pressure matter. Ninja style feels more effective against yokai, relying on movement, missed abilities, and avoiding heavy attacks rather than absorbing them. Magic also adds another layer of variety. Different spells and abilities give you extra tools for control, damage, or survivability, and mixing magic with weapons and style switching creates a huge number of viable playstyles. Instead of forcing one solution, the game constantly pushes you to adapt. Some fights reward patience and defense. Others reward speed and aggression. And because switching is so natural, it feels like you're adjusting tactics mid-fight rather than rebuilding your character. This alone adds a huge layer of player choice. You're constantly making decisions instead of repeating one approach, and that level of flexibility is a big reason why the combat stays engaging all the way to the end. And then a little bit about the depth and systems. This game has systems within systems. And I mean that in both a good and slightly overwhelming way. You have Kodama to find, which unlock blessings and small passive advantages that slowly improve your progression. You have separate skill trees and upgrades tied to different weapon styles, ninja abilities, samurai techniques, and magic, all expanding how your character evolves over time. There are a lot of menus, upgrades, and mechanics introduced early, and honestly, the beginning can feel like an information dump. Even as a returning Nioh player, I felt a little confused at first, trying to remember what everything did. And then there's progression itself. Upgrading gear, changing armor sets, skill trees, stat scaling, refining your build. Leveling up can feel a bit slow at times, but the constant flow of new weapons and armor keeps progression rewarding. I was constantly switching gear because something better always appeared. And the game really encourages experimentation rather than locking you into a single path. Over time, all these systems start to connect together, and that's when the game really clicks. And speaking of switching gear, loot plays a huge role in why the progression feels so satisfying. There's a lot of loot in this game. You're constantly finding new weapons, armor pieces, and equipment with different stats, bonuses, and abilities. There are light and heavy armor sets, different weapon variants, and small modifiers that can change how your build feels, even without fully respecting your character. What I really like is that the game encourages you to actually use what you find. Instead of just discovering one perfect weapon or armor set early on and upgrading that forever, Nioh 3 constantly gives you reasons to switch things up. New gear often feels immediately useful, so you naturally keep experimenting, changing weapons, changing armor, and adjusting your build as you go. Finding hidden paths, side areas, or extra enemies isn't just about completion, it's about excitement of potentially finding something better that actually changes your setup. And that's something I really appreciate, because in some other games I'll find one strong weapon early and never really have a reason to replace it. Here, progression feels more alive. You're constantly evolving instead of sticking to one static build. Because of that, exploration and defeating optional bosses feels meaningful. And speaking of bosses, they are brutally difficult. This game is hard. For me personally, it was definitely more difficult than Elden Ring, Demon's Souls, and the first Nioh. The good thing is that the game does give you options. Summoning NPCs or other players can help a lot, especially if you're struggling or just want to keep progressing without hitting a wall. But the difficulty doesn't come just from damage numbers, it comes from gameplay. There's so much going on. Fast attacks, delayed attacks, range pressure, AoE mechanics, movement-based punish windows. You're constantly adapting. Bosses were brutal for me personally. Most of them took several attempts. Every fight feels like a learning process. You slowly understand patterns, timings, and openings. And when everything finally clicks, beating a boss feels genuinely satisfying. And that's one of the strongest feelings this game delivers. Outside of bosses, the regular enemy design is strong overall. There's a good mix between human enemies and yokai, and the game does a solid job of making them feel different to fight. Human enemies tend to feel more technical and disciplined, rewarding careful timing and guard management, while yokai are more aggressive and unpredictable, often forcing you to rely more on movement and spacing. General enemies are usually much more manageable than bosses. Once you understand their patterns, they become part of the rhythm of exploration rather than major roadblocks. There is some repetition, especially for players familiar with previous Nioh games. You'll recognize several returning enemy types and yokai designs, which makes sense for the series but does slightly reduce the surprise factor after a while. And now for the weak spot. The story is honestly not that great. It's often confusing, not always told clearly, and because the game jumps between different time periods, it can be difficult to stay emotionally connected to what's happening. There are interesting ideas here, like political betrayal and time travel across Japanese history, but the storytelling itself doesn't always make those moments land. You play as Tokugawa Takechiyo, who is on the path to becoming shogun, before events spiral out of control, including betrayal from his younger brother, Kurimachu. On paper, it's a strong setup, and traveling between eras like Sengoku, Heian, Edo, and Bakumachu gives the game a lot of variety in setting. One thing that does work well though is that you can fully create your own character. The character creator is detailed and lets you feel more personally involved in the journey, even if the narrative around you isn't always very strong. The problem is that because the story moves so quickly between historical events and characters, it rarely slows down enough for emotional moments to really hit. There are lots of important names and encounters, but few that felt genuinely memorable for me. The time-traveling concept is also a bit mixed. It's nice to revisit enemies or situations that previously defeated you, but overall I'm not sure the constant jumping between eras was really necessary. So while the ideas are interesting, the execution feels more like a framework to support the gameplay rather than a strong narrative experience. Moving to sound and voice. The music is fine, it fits the atmosphere well enough and supports the action, but honestly, nothing really stuck in my head after finishing the game. Some tracks and sound elements also feel familiar, and it's clear that parts of the music and audio design are reused or heavily inspired by previous Nioh games. That's not necessarily bad, but it does make the soundtrack feel a bit less fresh and less memorable overall. Voice acting is a bit more mixed. In my opinion, the Japanese voice acting works much better. Not just because it fits the setting, but because the performances feel more natural and consistent.
甲斐の虎と呼ばれた信玄のことよ。兵を伏せておるである。
The English voice acting isn't terrible, but the quality feels uneven, and some performances don't really carry the same weight or atmosphere.
It's been years since my last real battle, but somehow I got out of there alive. But New Yokai will...
And quickly about the graphics and performance, visually the game looks good. The art direction is strong, environments are varied, and the overall atmosphere fits the Japanese folklore setting really well. It might not be the most cutting-edge graphical showcase out there, but it looks clean, stylish, and consistent. Performance was solid overall for me, but it's definitely demanding. You can feel the game pushing hardware, especially during bigger encounters or more complex areas, but once everything is configured properly, it runs smoothly and feels stable. And now, before my final verdict, why Nioh is underrated? The biggest reason is simply how good it feels to play. The depth of combat and the amount of systems layered together can be overwhelming at first, and I honestly think that scares some players away. Souls games are elegant and simple on the surface. Nioh is more like, here are 45 mechanics, good luck. And that complexity means the game asks more from the player early on. But once everything clicks, the payoff is huge. The combat feels incredibly satisfying, builds feel flexible, and mastering the systems feel genuinely rewarding. And that's why I think the series doesn't get the mainstream attention it deserves. It's not as immediately accessible, but for players who enjoy deep mechanics, it's one of the best feeling action RPGs out there. Alright, and let's wrap things up with the final login scores. Story and setting first is a 7 out of 10. Not the strongest part of the game. The historical setting and time travel idea are interesting, but the storytelling feels confusing at times and the characters never really become memorable. It works as a background for gameplay, but not much more than that. Gameplay and controls, this is a 10 out of 10. This is where Nioh 3 shines. Combat is fast, deep, and incredibly satisfying with strong weapon variety, great responsiveness, and systems that reward mastery. Definitely the best part of the game. And then game design, this one I'll give it a 9 out of 10. The overall design is excellent with strong boss encounters, smart progression systems, and meaningful exploration. Some enemy repetition keeps it from a perfect score, but the quality is consistently high. And then player choice, well, there are no narrative choices, but for gameplay, there is actually a lot of choice. That's why player choice actually gets a 9 out of 10. The ability to switch between ninja and samurai styles, combined with build flexibility and magic options, gives players huge freedom in how they approach combat and progression. And then graphics and art style, this is a very beautiful game. Not the most beautiful game out there, but it's definitely very solid. And the art style is very beautiful as well. So it's a strong 9 out of 10. And then performance and stability, I had no problems with the performance. Performance is solid overall, although definitely it can be quite demanding on the hardware. Once properly set up, the game runs smoothly and feels stable even during intense fights. So performance and stability gets a 9 out of 10. And sound and music, well, audio works well with the atmosphere, but the soundtrack isn't very memorable and some music and sound designs feel familiar from earlier Nioh games. Japanese voice acting is clearly stronger than the English performance, so with the Japanese voice acting, this is a solid 8 out of 10. With an English voice acting, this probably goes to 7 out of 10. And then innovation and creativity. The ninja and samurai switching mechanic is genuinely great idea that adds flexibility, and I think this could be a standard for a lot of these type of games to come. But overall the game builds more on refinement than major reinvention. But because of the switching between ninja and samurai styles works so well, it gets an 8 out of 10. And length and value, there's a lot of content here with many bosses, build options, and constant gear upgrades that make exploration feel rewarding and keeps the experience fresh. So length and value gets a solid 9 out of 10. And fun and engagement, it's challenging and sometimes brutal, but the gameplay loop is so satisfying that it keeps pulling you back for one more fight, one more upgrade, and one more attempt. So I'd say it's a solid 9 out of 10. Maybe with a really good story, this could be a full 10 out of 10. But maybe for a lot of you, probably it is a 10 out of 10. For me, I think it's a very fun game. It's a good, solid 9 out of 10. And that gives Nioh 3 the final score of 87 out of 100. So it's not quite perfect, but it's a very good game and very fun. Especially gameplay is excellent. And for players that really enjoy gameplay, they should definitely play Nioh 3 if they also enjoy challenging and difficult games. So Nioh 3 delivers some of the deepest and most rewarding combat in the genre. For players who enjoy mastery, experimentation, and challenge, this is absolutely one of the most underrated action RPG series out there. With this score, Nioh 3 officially moved to the top of the login League of Games table for 2026 so far with 87 points. It is now the best rated game of 2026. If you enjoyed the review, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Login, and let me know your rating for Nioh 3 down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next review.